Jesus once said that a city set on a hill cannot be hid, and ancient Pergamum was just such a city. It's the third of the 7 churches of Asia, and it's about 100 miles north of Ephesus. The library and the temples of Pergamum were located on this hill, Acropolis. The tower is nearly 1,000 feet above the rest of the city. Sir William Ramsay, one of the earliest English archaeologists who worked here, said that of all the cities of Asia Minor, this deserves to be called a royal city because of this spectacular Acropolis. A sacred way goes from the base of the Acropolis to the Temple of Asclepius a half-mile away. And from this column-lined street, we can see how the Acropolis towers over the surrounding plains. And we can see the ancient temples and theater on the summit of the Acropolis. In New Testament times, the lower city, where many of the common people had their homes, was in the fertile Caicus River Valley around the base of the Acropolis. And today, that's where the modern city of Pergamum is located. Pergamum had been an important city for many centuries before the birth of Christ. But in the 2nd century BC, King Attalus began to fear the growing power of Rome in the west. He realized that his kingdom could not hold off the Roman legions, and he decided that it would be better to surrender his kingdom to the Romans rather than wait to be conquered. This happened in 133 BC. King Attalus made a wise decision because the Romans rewarded Pergamum in many ways. It was the capital of Asia for the next 250 years and became the center of emperor worship in Asia. For Pergamum, this meant peace and prosperity, but for the Christians who lived here, it meant hard choices and suffering. Now let's visit some of the buildings on this imposing Acropolis. Just a few years after John wrote Revelation, the people of Pergamum built a great temple in honor of the Emperor Trajan. This temple is the most beautiful building still standing on the Acropolis, and we'll come back to it later. 2 other buildings standing side by side were the Temple of Athena and the library. These rows of columns mark the location of the Temple of Athena. Athena was one of the most important Greek goddesses, and the temple here was 2 stories high with many columns. Although Athena was worshipped here, it was also a museum, perhaps the first museum anywhere. The library was next to the temple, and the only access to the library was through the temple. The walls of the library that are still standing are not very impressive, and they don't reflect the importance of this library. Ian, I like libraries, and we're sitting together in front of the library here at Pergamum that was the 2nd greatest library in the ancient world. Only Alexandria surpassed it. Tell me about the rivalry between these 2 libraries.
Yes, this is an interesting story. When the king of Pergamum wanted to build a library that would rival that in Alexandria, he hired the librarian from Alexandria. This infuriated the pharaoh who put the librarian in prison, and the pharaoh then refused to sell writing materials, which was papyrus, to the king of Pergamum. So the king of Pergamum put out a challenge to his people to develop an alternate writing material, and they came up with parchment, which is the use of animal skins for writing. This is known in Latin as Pergamum sheets.
And isn't it true that our greatest biblical manuscripts were written on parchment?
Yes, and that also introduced the form that we know of a book, which we call a codex, no longer written on scrolls, but now written on pages in the form of a book, a codex.
And all of that happened right here?
Right here in this library.
Even though little remains now, this library was more important than the library of Celsus at Ephesus in New Testament times. It gave us parchment, and without that durable writing material, we might not have old, trustworthy manuscripts of our New Testament. Husnu, tell me what finally happened to this library.
According to George Bean, it was given as a present by Antonius, who did not own the library, to Cleopatra, who had other things to do than read.
And this was the Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt,
yes.
And the library declined after that?
Yes, yes. After several wars, it was burnt down, and we have nothing left from the library now.
But according to Plutarch, this library had 200,000 volumes at the time Mark Antony gave it to Cleopatra. Ancient cities had to have walls to protect them from threatening armies, and the wall here at Pergamum was built around the top of the Acropolis. No enemy could storm these massive walls on the mountaintop. So whenever the city was in danger, the people took refuge inside this wall and were safe. The Pergamum Theater was located on the steep mountainside just below the summit of the Acropolis. Music and drama were very important in Greece, and since the cities of Asia were really Greek in language and culture, their theaters were important in preserving this cultural heritage. But there was no other theater like this one at Pergamum. Every seat had a breathtaking view of the river valley and the plain nearly 1,000 feet below. The cave seating area followed the natural contour of the Acropolis rock, so this theater was taller and steeper than any other.
And it is less than a semicircle, and in order to compensate for the capacity, they have constructed more rows of seats than the regular. This theater has 80 rows of seats with a seating capacity of 10,000. Also, as you can see, it's the steepest cavea, the seat of all.
The steepest one
The steepest one, yes.
I can just imagine how spectacular it would be to attend a musical concert here at night, listening to the music and watching the sun set beyond the mountains in the west.
Yes.
Spectacular.
Just above the theater, we can see the foundations of the royal balcony where the king and his guests had their seats. It's a long way from the royal balcony down to the stage. And the stage area was so narrow that they could not build a permanent stage building like most Greek theaters have.
What is this little temple over here?
It was a temple dedicated to Dionysus and constructed in the 2nd century BC. But then in the 3rd century AD, it was reconstructed and dedicated to Emperor Caracalla for emperor worship.
Emperor worship in the 3rd century.
Yes.
Caracalla lived more than 100 years after John wrote Revelation. So this temple shows that for nearly 300 years, Pergamum continued to be the main center of emperor worship in Asia. Pergamum got its water from springs several miles away, and they built an aqueduct to bring the water into the city. Long sections of this aqueduct are still in place, and we can see some of them from the Acropolis. When they built this aqueduct, they knew enough about hydraulic engineering that they were able to force the water through pipes for the last 2 miles and then up to the top of the Acropolis. So all the palaces and the temples up here had plenty of running water. Now we're going to leave the Acropolis and go down to the lower city where we can visit the temple of Asclepius. A sacred way leads from the base of the Acropolis to the temple. It's a beautiful street, a half-mile long, paved with marble and lined with columns.
In the Lord's letter to the church in Pergamum, he referred to their city as the place where Satan had his throne and the place where Satan dwelled. Where was Satan's throne here in Pergamum? Evidently, it was some place of immorality and pagan worship so notorious that the early Christians would have known instantly where it was. But we can't be sure. Where was Satan's throne? There are a number of possibilities. The first one is the temple of Asclepius, where we are now.
This temple, called the Asclepion, served 2 functions. It was a temple where the god was worshipped, and it was also a hospital.
Asclepion is very important because it was one of the 2 biggest hospitals in the ancient world. Also, the Dr. Galen was born here and he was trained here. Especially, he trained by healing the injuries of the gladiators from the gladiator school nearby. He is known to be the first doctor to use diagnosis in therapy.
Galen learned anatomy by working on the broken bodies of gladiators. Later, he served as the personal physician for 3 emperors. One was Caracalla, whose temple we visited on the Acropolis. In the ancient world, medicine and the worship of Asclepius went hand in hand. Asclepius was the god of healing, so his temple was the hospital, and his priests were the doctors. The greatest temple to Asclepius was at Epidaurus in Greece. The one here at Pergamum was begun about 350 BC, and it became the 2nd greatest in the Roman world. These 2 temples would have been the Mayo Clinic of the ancient world. Sick people came from everywhere to beseech the god for healing. The Asclepion was a square area about 400 feet long with colonnaded stoas on 3 sides. Several of the large columns are still standing with the architrave, the marble beams across the top, still in place. The temple had a small theater seating about 3,500. It's been restored and is now used for musical concerts. Every sanctuary of Asclepius was built around a sacred spring where the water was believed to have healing powers. Some of the springs here are still flowing. Along with medicines, the priests used a variety of treatments. Bathing in pools like this, mud packs, and bloodletting. They also used the rite of incubation. A 2nd century scholar named Aristides, who was chronically ill, came to Pergamum for healing, and he has described this rite of incubation. The patient spent the night alone in an underground room, and in the very words of Aristides, they slept the night in the temple in hopes that the god Asclepius would either miraculously cure their ailment or appear to them in a dream with a prescription to cure it. The patient may have waited in underground rooms that have not yet been excavated, or perhaps in this long underground hallway. Notice the openings in the ceiling. If a priest came during the night and spoke through the opening and told the sick man that he would be healed, and if he believed that it was the voice of Asclepius himself, it might well bring healing. Psychotherapy at an ancient hospital. But let's go back to Satan's throne. How could anyone think that a place of healing could be an evil place where Satan dwells? The answer is simple. The symbol of Asclepius was the serpent, and wherever Asclepius was worshipped, there were pictures of snakes. Some were crude, others beautifully carved on marble columns, and even today the snake remains the symbol of the medical profession. But for Christians, the serpent was Satan, who had tempted Adam and Eve and brought sin and death into the world. So for Christians, the Asclepion might have been where Satan had his throne. But there are at least 2 other places in Pergamum where Satan might have had his throne. And since the Asclepion was a place of healing and service, one of the other places might be more likely.
Where was Satan's throne? A second possibility is that it may have been the great altar of Zeus, located on the platform behind me, and many scholars believe that this is the right answer. The area was excavated by the Germans in the 1870s, and they planted the trees to mark the spot.
The altar of Zeus was built about 160 BC to commemorate the victory of Pergamum in driving back the Gauls that were invading from the north. It was situated on a natural terrace about 80 feet below the summit of the Acropolis, and it could be seen from far away. Near the altar, an agora served the needs of the people that came into the upper city. Some of the massive walls near the agora are still in place. When the Germans began work here in the 1870s, they quickly discovered that the altar was in ruins. Hundreds of years earlier, sections had been knocked down and reused in building fortifications. The archaeologists recovered all the fragments they could find, took them to Berlin, and spent many years restoring the altar. It was finally put on display in 1930. The word altar may be misleading. The altar was a large building shaped like a horseshoe around marble steps that led up to the altar where Zeus was worshipped. This building was about 50 feet high with delicate ionic columns around the top. The altar had a frieze carved in marble around the base. This frieze is 360 feet long, and it has more than 100 figures larger than life size. The figures of the Olympian gods and goddesses fighting the giants from Gaul. Here, the gods of the sea are driving the giants up the steps. Athena holds one of the giants by the hair, and a sacred serpent is about to strike him to death. You can see the fear of death on his face. Next, the goddess of night is about to throw a vase at a giant, and the vase has a deadly snake coiled around it. This altar is one of the greatest treasures of Hellenistic art, and Turkey would like to have it back. We saw posters at archaeological sites in Turkey with the plea, "We want it back," but it's not likely that the Germans will ever return it. The altar honored Zeus and Athena Nike, the goddess of victory, but the frieze included most of the Greek pantheon. Zeus was often called Zeus the Savior, And all of this would have been so anathema to the Christians that the altar of Zeus might have been Satan's throne. But there's one more possibility.
Where was Satan's throne? A third possibility is that this expression refers to a series of temples dedicated to emperor worship. The most spectacular of these is the temple to Trajan that was built about 20 years after John wrote Revelation. All of these temples posed a tremendous problem to Christians when they were forced to confess Caesar is Lord or face death.
This temple was built by Hadrian, Trajan's adopted son, who followed his father on the throne in AD 117. A new festival honoring Zeus and Trajan was begun here in this temple, and later Hadrian was also worshipped here. The temple is over 200 feet long and stands on the highest point on the Acropolis. The columns that are still standing, with part of the pediment restored, show that this was a temple of surpassing beauty.
Pergamum had been the main center for emperor worship in Asia for 150 years before they built this temple to Trajan. The Romans allowed Pergamum to build a temple to Augustus in 29 BC, the first one in Asia. For the next 40 years, this was the only place in Asia where the emperor was worshipped. Later, when temples were built at Smyrna and Ephesus, the one at Pergamum remained the most important. Archaeologists have not found the temple of Augustus, but they have found coins with a picture of the temple on one side and this temple of Trajan on the other side. Also, we need to remember the temple dedicated to Caracalla near the theater. So Pergamum was thrice temple keeper for the emperors, first to Augustus, then Trajan, and then Caracalla.
We also need to remember that Pergamum had many other temples, the altar of Zeus and temples to Athena, Asclepius, and many others. Paul would have called it a city filled with idolatry. For Christians, the temples to Zeus and the other Greek gods were no big problem. They could be ignored. But not the emperor's temple. The Christians in the 7 churches sometimes faced a cruel test. Burn a little incense before the emperor's statue and confess that Caesar is Lord, or face the charge of treason. Christ or Caesar? It was a tough choice for the Christians. Nowhere else in Asia was this choice so painful, so costly as in Pergamum. And for this reason, Satan was probably on his throne at the temples of the emperors where this choice had to be made. We know that Christians died for their faith here. In the letter to the church, we read about Antipas, the faithful witness who had been killed where Satan dwells. But in spite of persecution, the Christians stood firm in their faith, and the church grew, as this building shows. The Red Basilica is the largest ancient structure still standing in Pergamum. It's an immense building, the temple and courtyard nearly 700 feet long. It's made of brick rather than stone, and was built in the 2nd century as a temple to the Egyptian gods Isis and Serapis. But when persecution ended and the once despised faith became popular, the Christians took over this temple about AD 400 and turned it into a church, and they named it in honor of John.
In his letter to Pergamum, Jesus commended the church for remaining true to him and not renouncing their faith in him, even though Antipas was martyred here where Satan's throne is.
But in spite of the faithfulness of some in Pergamum, there were others who compromised their faith following the example of Balaam and Balak in the Old Testament. And like Israel, the compromise in Pergamum seemingly was in the practice of idolatry. Christians of all ages will be tempted to compromise their faith, especially by trying to live in Christ and in the world at the same time. The sharp warning to Pergamum was, "Repent then. If not, I will come to you soon and war against them with the sword of my mouth." The reward of faithful saints who conquered Satan by dying without compromising their faith in Jesus was hidden manna, or spiritual food that would sustain them forever.
This letter has some obvious warnings for our churches today. First, we're warned that a little compromise may open the floodgates of immorality. The Nicolaitans in the church probably began by arguing that they had to make a few concessions to Caesar. A pinch of incense at the altar, a few meaningless words, this was not too bad. But soon the Nicolaitans were into the worst immorality. Clement of Alexandria said that they abandoned themselves to pleasure like goats. Another warning is that even when we confess our faith in words, we can deny it in how we live. We don't choose between Christ and Caesar today. Our choices are more subtle. We have to choose between Christ and a culture that is saturated with sex and self-indulgence. Today, Satan's throne is everywhere, in the mass media, in our music and movies, even in the living room. Like the Christians at Pergamum, we do have to make a choice. And that choice is whether to follow Jesus as Lord in the way we live.
Precious